Okay. Right. I think we'll push on there, Jonathan, if that's all right with you.
Okay.
Right. I'm going to make you the host now.
Okay.
There we go. Okay, you're the host, so it's over to yourself, Jonathan.
Just make sure, first of all, before I sort of take control of the thing, that it actually works. Right, is that working, James? Did that work, James? No. Huh. Right, let's just see. Sorry about this, folks.
Sorry, you couldn't hear me then?
No, I couldn't, no.
No,
right.
So no, it didn't.
Let's just have another go.
You go on to share screen?
Yeah, I went on to share screen.
And then you click on the sort of bit you want to, your PowerPoint presentation or whatever it is. And that should bring it all up.
Right. Okay, hold on.
Oh, that's it.
Okay.
Brilliant.
And I need to make it big. There we are.
Brilliant.
As I say, I usually have a producer to help me do all the sort of complex technical bits. Very good. Well, look, good evening to you all. What I want to do this evening is have a very, broad and general and fairly speedy chat with you, raising some of the issues about the media and covering conflicts, particularly today, but reaching back a little into the past to draw some examples there. There are going to be quite a lot of pictures because I think it's more interesting than looking at me. It's a kind of, I suppose, my BBC career's holiday snaps, but holidays in rather desperate locations in some cases. But bear with me. I worked as the BBC Defence Correspondent and Diplomatic Correspondent for the best part of 20 plus years. I was at the BBC for some 30 years. How do you get into these things? And well, I suppose too many airfix toy soldiers to start with. I was always very interested in military history. When I left university, I got a job with a Labour MP on the House of Commons Defence Committee. And that got me interested in writing about contemporary defence things. And from that, I got my job at the BBC, initially at the World Service at Bush House. And I suppose then the rest is kind of history, as it were. Now, of course, the BBC I joined back in 1985 or so was a BBC that was reporting very much on the Cold War, which was at its height. The first place the BBC ever sent me was East Berlin. And you had this extraordinary, I remember having a rather significant row with a border guard as I went through Checkpoint Charlie. They sent me down the diplomatic route, and the officer told me to go back and go round again. And when I came out, a guy started screaming at me in German from up on top of a gantry. And I put my bags down and rather shouted back at him. And boy, when I got into East Berlin and the door shut behind you, boy, did you realize that you were in a kind of a different world. But I think the main theme of what I'm going to be talking about is change. Changes in what we report, how we report it, and the audience that we're reporting to. I want to start off by probably what was the best trip I ever did for the BBC, which was back in 1991 in Sevastopol in the Crimea, and now obviously very much a point of contention again, seized by the Russians from Ukraine. This is autumn 1991. It's the Royal Marine Band on the quayside at Sevastopol, and it's the visit of HMS Fearless, I think it was the Dartmouth Academy sort of flagship at the time. And it was the first Royal Navy visit to Sevastopol for 40 years. If you think the Cold War was slowly coming to an end, we just had the hardline coup against Gorbachev, I think a few weeks before. It was still very much the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union was very much on decline. And one of the places we visited was Balaclava Harbor, and this is Balaclava Harbor as we saw it. And if you see there on the top right-hand corner, you see the ruins of the Phoenician lighthouse that was there. Balaclava was by this time a Soviet submarine base. This is a painting back in the day of the Crimea War itself, and you can see the same little Phoenician lighthouse on the right. And as we were walking along the quayside, one of the Royal Navy photographers who was with us had his camera over his shoulder, and he was clicking away, and he was clicking away at this, which was a submarine that nobody had ever seen before. It's a Soviet Beluga class submarine, very early version. And I said to him, you know, what are you doing? And he said, oh, shh, don't say a word, don't say a word, don't draw any attention. And I said, well, for goodness sake, there's an ITN TV crew filming the whole thing there. The Russians just don't care anymore. The Cold War is over, you know, nobody bothers. And in fact, the next day I went across to the Soviet naval base, the main Soviet naval base, and British Ministry of Defence guy insisted on coming with me because he feared that there was going to be a terrible diplomatic incident. And I marched up to the guard at the naval base, and I said my sort of 2 of my 4 words of Russian. I said, correspondent BBC, England. Can I come in? And the guy said, yeah, of course you can come in. And I wandered around this naval base where there was a scene of kind of ecological destruction. There was a minesweeper sunk at its moorings. There were chemical drums leaking left, right, and center. It was an extraordinary shift from the Soviet superpower that we had known before. And again, this view with the Phoenician lighthouse up on the top left there, that's as it was back at the time of the Crimea War with the Phoenician lighthouse just there. Now, of course, the Crimea was one of the first conflicts where journalism had a significant role to play, and indeed photography. And certainly post facto, after the event of the war, the reports of William Howard Russell in the Times had a significant role in drawing the British public's attention to the problems of the British military, its archaic practices, and so on. And one of the main things I want to, talk to you about now is, as I say, to emphasize, is this idea of change. We've gone through 9/11, the Balkans, Afghanistan, Iraq, the Cold War, counterterrorism, what we call hybrid war now, and perhaps a return to a Cold War of sorts with China. We live in a very different society. You might argue less patriotic, more risk averse, perhaps, more questioning. The military experience for most people is very distant in the world that I'm sure we all grew up in. I remember, the major up the road, a major from the Second World War, the colonel up the road, again from the Second World War. Conscription, of course, has ended by that time. And as time has gone on, as the military in many countries, particularly in our own, has become a smaller and smaller segment of the population, so the military experience is that much more distant from the run-of-the-mill population. The media has changed dramatically too. It's much more diverse, it's much more politicized, much more market-driven. When I started, every single newspaper, every single news outlet had a professional defence correspondent, often people who had had some military experience themselves. The BBC actually had 2 defence correspondents. We've then gone through extraordinary technological change in the media, which I will touch on in a moment. But of course, relations between the media and the military have always been difficult. These are the 3 things, sorry, I should have moved on there. The changing nature of conflict, the changing nature of society, the changing nature of the media. This is General Sherman, Union commander in the American Civil War. And you can see he didn't have much time for the media. He says, I say in giving intelligence to the enemy and sowing discord and discontent, these men fulfill all the conditions of spies. And that kind of hostility, that fundamental sense of suspicion about the media has really pervaded relations between journalists and the military certainly up until the time I started doing journalism. You had the idea that the media had lost Vietnam. That was an idea which even many senior British military figures had taken from their American counterparts. One of the things I think that changed relations significantly was the conflict in Northern Ireland, albeit an internal conflict in the British Isles, but one where the army in particular had to develop a much better, closer, regular, routine relationship with journalists and the media. Now, of course, the Falklands War was not run by the army in terms of the media. It was run by the Navy. And the Navy had had very little modern experience, if you like, of operating with the media. There was censorship. You couldn't even say there was censorship, but there was. The word censored was censored out of reports. That's why Brian Hanrahan, my colleague, used his famous sentence when asked about the potential losses from an airstrike. And he said, "I'm not allowed to say how many planes joined the raid, but I counted them all out," in his famous phrase, and I counted them all back. Journalists were entirely dependent on naval satellite communications, which was often denied. For a very significant part of the war, there were no television pictures. There was just radio, if you like, on the television with still photos of the correspondents concerned. A very small number of correspondents were allowed to embark with the task force. They were all British. And even the whole mechanics of information handling by the government and by the Ministry of Defence was pretty haphazard. For example, when on the 4th of May, HMS Sheffield was hit by an Exocet missile at around 1400 GMT, the government wouldn't confirm anything. By early evening, political sources were telling the BBC that indeed the warship had been hit and very severely damaged. And the government only got its act together by the 9 o'clock news that evening, when the news was actually interrupted and it went to a official broadcast from the Ministry of Defence, the famous Mr. MacDonald, Ian MacDonald, the government spokesman, who finally confirmed the news to the nation. And I think that underscores, you know, some of the elements of control that in the past the military were able to exert over journalists. This is post-Falklands. It's me interviewing the commander of HMS Triumph, who, funnily enough, I was at university with. But you know, if the Falklands War was, as some people said, the worst reported war since the Crimea, it's partly because of the context. The Navy controlled access, it controlled the elements of transmission, and it's exactly like that here. We're out somewhere off the Scottish coast. We've just boarded from a tender on the left, and we're there alone, entirely dependent on officialdom for being able to get the message across. This is the War to Liberate Kuwait. A rather different war, but again, relatively limited access directly to the front line. The embedding system that came subsequently in the Iraq War and so on hadn't been much developed by then. There was very good press center set up in Saudi Arabia, but you could still do a fair bit on your own. I mean, I reported on this from London, and then I went out to Kuwait pretty much immediately as the forces entered Kuwait City. There's a transmitter button that I pulled out of one of those tanks at the Mutler Ridge, which was probably a fairly stupid thing to do, my press pass. And this, the picture we opened with, is actually in Iraq. That's my vehicle there. Only an idiot would put white V markings on a white vehicle, but I suppose we didn't have any black tape. But this is in Iraq. We tried to get into Iraq, being stopped on the main road by American tanks. So we veered off to the northeast. And this is actually looking towards Uncasa Naval Base. You can see some cranes on the left-hand side. And we were driving along a road past this line of Bradley American armored vehicles, which we didn't know was the furthest the Americans had advanced. And we saw a Humvee chasing us with guys waving wildly. And we stopped, and they luckily told us that we'd just gone into Iraq and invited us to turn around and join them, which we very happily did. Of course, one of the great changes of the Gulf War was so-called Scud FM, the predecessor of 5 Live Radio, a live news channel that was able to constantly adapt and report on stories as they emerged. We didn't, of course, have here 24-hour news television at that point. Then we go on to Bosnia. I went up to Vitez with the Cheshires, Colonel Bob Stewart, when they first arrived in Croatia, and then drove inland. Very restrictive rules set by the UN at that stage. In theory, we couldn't even go in a UN vehicle. We couldn't expect any support from the UN. But Bob Stewart was fantastic. He gathered all the British journalists together and said, you know, if you get into trouble, my boys will come and get you. Don't worry. And again, the technology was improving. We had satellite phones by now, huge, great things that you needed, you know, a vehicle to move, like in a great trunk. But you were able to get news out relatively quickly. And I remember being in Vitez, which was a sort of, the headquarters building was like a 1960s British comprehensive school. It was that style of architecture, a school that they had taken over. And I remember being outside the ops room there and hearing a contact radio message come in, the first time that the British forces had been fired on. And we were able to clarify what had happened, or as best what had happened, get the satellite phone up and get that on the BBC probably within about a half an hour or so, which was a huge, huge step forward. That's me in Bosnia. We can pass over that. We had I think that was a semi-armored Land Rover. I mean, that was the other extraordinary thing about Bosnia. We began to have this whole logistics operation for operating in war zones. So not just flak jackets and helmets, but armored vehicles. That's only armored in the cab, that one. The rest of it was pretty vulnerable. We then go on to the Iraq War, another huge step forward. By then you have the real impact of live 24-hour news, such that you could sit and watch CNN and wait for the war to begin as you saw the bombs falling on Baghdad. We kind of knew when it was going to begin because there was a huge drinks party and dinner paid for by the Sun newspaper for all the senior British officers. I was at CENTCOM at the time in the Gulf, and in theory they were all going to stay the night because they all expected, I suppose, to drink rather too much. And in the event, most of them didn't drink too much, and they went back, and we all assumed then that night the war was going to start. And sure enough, we watched it on CNN. There were some 5,000 journalists in the region covering the conflict by now. As I say, I was at CENTCOM in Qatar. Some 700 of these journalists were embedded. In other words, they were operating with each of the units involved in the campaign. About 16 journalists were actually killed as a result in the first very intense 2 weeks of combat. But the great thing about the embedded reporters was that you got eyes on the ground. Now you've got very particular eyes. Sometimes you got very expert eyes. Sometimes you got very inexpert eyes. But if you knew who was with which unit, and you knew what was the unfolding sort of picture, as it were, you could piece together the jigsaw quite well. And that's what I was doing at CENTCOM, and I was providing that every day for pretty much all of the BBC radio and television, and indeed by that stage, I think, online outlets. And the reason I've got this silly map from the start of Dad's Army is that the way I worked there is that every morning I would go and see a guy called Simon Wren, who was the chief British press officer, who I knew very, very well. And he would come from the headquarters, where there was literally a big screen with all of the units and their markers identified. And we would have a briefing where I would draw a freehand map of Iraq, and I would draw an arrow like this, and he would say, no, 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 further to the west. And I'd say by this afternoon, and he'd say, no, middle of the next night. And I would get a very, very good picture. Now, obviously, I wasn't going to go and broadcast in advance exactly what was happening, but it did give me, between that, and I mean, that's another example of the maps that I was drawing, it gave me a very good idea of how things were unfolding and the sort of matrix in which I could piece the various individual news reports that were coming from the embedded correspondents themselves. And this business of experience and inexperience in correspondence, it may shock you, but I mean, most young people today don't make airfix kits. They can't name you every World War II fighter aircraft and so on, as perhaps people in my generation could. And I remember, you know, very early in the Iraq War, there was a terrible tragedy. 2 Sea King helicopters collided, and a significant number of British Special Forces went into the water and were killed. And I actually got a phone call from a fairly senior BBC editor who told me that probably I would be coming home now because the war wouldn't happen. Well, that shows you the kind of level of sort of military understanding that people had. I want to look a little bit now again at some of the technical stuff that we do, just to give you a historical parallel. Very bad picture. The uniforms are all wrong, which just shows you've got to be very careful about historical sources. But the Waterloo Dispatch, the famous dispatch that told of Wellington's victory in Belgium, left Brussels in the hands of Henry Percy of the 14th Light Dragoons on the 19th of June, and travelling via Ostend and Broadstairs, it arrived in the morning 3 days later. Well, how things gradually change. That's the way things were done in World War II, recording in the field onto a gramophone disc that had to be sent to a station way in the rear, and it could be then sent on to London. On the left is what I started with in '85, a Ewer, a reel-to-reel tape recorder that was incredibly heavy. And if it dropped from the strap on your shoulder, which it often did, it usually did significant damage to your ankles. On the right, what I ended up with, tiny little digital recorder, looks like a shaver, but it's about that size, a complete transformation in the technology that we use. Similarly, your iPhone, frankly, is a mobile journalism studio. This is a picture of a particular program, an electronic news gathering program that we have. And as you can see there, you can do film, you can do stills, you can use the microphone to record sound. And by just pushing one button, you can direct that to a particular point in the BBC where all parts of the organization can use the material. So it's very much, if you like, pocket broadcasting. And it's not just radio, television has been miniaturized as well. It's not, you know, the all singing, all dancing, fantastic television standards that we might have come to expect, but now the pandemic with lots of broadcasting from home has perhaps reduced those standards. And the next little thing I'm going to show you is a little bit of film, one of the last jobs I did at the BBC before the pandemic, which is myself and my producer coming off a Spanish landing ship, an amphibious landing ship off Rota in the Bay of Biscay. And Stuart on the left, you can see his hands, is filming on a GoPro. I'm sure some of you are familiar with these tiny little cameras. I'm actually filming this on my iPhone. And as you'll see, it is all perfectly usable, perfectly broadcastable, but with no baggage or lights or complex impedimenta of any kind. and the technology is extraordinary. And the internet now means you can record from anywhere, you can broadcast from anywhere. That's me being interviewed, I think, on the way back from a NATO meeting on the Eurostar. Looks like it's still possibly in France, but in fact, I think it's certainly still in France. But you can broadcast from anywhere. I'm afraid it isn't all about going to exciting or glamorous places. Probably about 80% of stuff you do from your hotel room, very early in the morning or very late at night. But this extraordinary access that we have now, and our extraordinary ability to look at sources from all over the world, the relative expertise or lack of expertise amongst some journalists poses all sorts of problems for officialdom. This is just one small episode. This is the BBC website story, which quotes me, the night the Serbs shot down an F-117 aircraft over Kosovo. I remember I was there with a colleague, Mark Leahy, and we'd done a deal. He would do one night on call, I'd do the next. It happened that this went down on my night, turned up outside NATO in the middle of the night with a cameraman. We're looking on a monitor at grainy pictures from Serbian TV. And of course, they say to you, well, what do you think it is? Luckily, I made lots of airplanes when I was little, and I still kept quite an interest in them. And I mean, there was no doubt it was an F-117 from some of the particular elements of the design of the debris. That's what I said there. I think on the television, I was even much more affirmative that it was. They had an expert on who told me it was a Danish F-16, and it was absolutely clear, Dutch F-16, and it was clear from the numbers that was utter rubbish. I actually knew him very well. He's a nice guy. So I said, well, we're all looking at grainy photos. None of us can be sure, but as far as I'm concerned, it's an F-117. Of course, NATO initially had to deny that the plane was shot down, and it took them quite a while, I think, to catch up. Having looked at the changes in the way we go out broadcasting things, I want to look a little bit about the changing nature of conflict. I mean, much of military history has always been the search for a decisive battle. This is at Gettysburg, one of my favorite. I'm quite interested in the American Civil War. It's one of my favorite places to go. Even Gettysburg probably wasn't quite as decisive as sort of myth tells us. It was certainly the last time the South invaded the North, but the war went on for some considerable time afterwards. And this absence of decisive victory, particularly so since increasingly we fight wars of choice. I mean, I suppose you could argue the Falklands War was not a war of choice, but all of the other military interventions since then, in one way or another, have been wars of choice. And that means, and this is a quote from my ex-colleague Mark, who went on to work for NATO, but as he rightly points out, you know, success is increasingly conditional and limiting. There's no such thing as absolute victory. You have limited aims, limited objectives, and so on. And that makes both the job of the media and the job of officialdom trying to get their narrative out that much more complicated. Even in places where you might say, this is actually up on the Golan Heights, even in places where you might say, well, war it still is decisive, and it still is, in some sense, I suppose, for national survival. Well, you just look at the recent Gaza episode, a repeat of so many Gaza episodes before. Nothing really terribly decisive about that. Just as a pointer, another element of the way we work, this is a young guy, Matthew Woodcraft, who has now left the BBC, and he's actually just arrived at NATO in Iraq. He's now works for the Ministry of Defence here. But we were up on the Golan doing a series of feature programs, and we'd been promised an exercise to gather lots of sound for radio. There was no exercise, it was cancelled. So on the way back, we drove around the Golan Heights looking for a tank unit, finally found somebody who would turn their tank on and give us the noise of a tank rumbling up and down on the Golan Heights. And that's what Matthew was doing there. But, you know, most wars, as we see in Gaza, as we see in the Balkans and so on, are fought amongst populations. And that, as Rupert Smith, one of the more thoughtful, I think, British generals of recent times, amplifies the central role of the media. As he says, we fight in every living room as well as in the streets and fields of an actual conflict zone. And that means that, you know, things are questioned in different ways. Is leaving Afghanistan now the end of something, or is it the beginning? Is it part of a wider American withdrawal of troops from the Middle East? All of these questions are still to be answered. And we move now into something which is called warfare in the grey zone or hybrid warfare. This really rather extraordinary state that exists between peace and war. You know, in our generation, we know what peace looks like. We know what war looks like, or certainly people remember what war looks like. Well, what we now have is something in between. And these are the famous Russian little green men in Crimea, in Ukraine. But, you know, what is our relationship with Russia at the moment? Russia has assassinated one person on British soil. It's tried to assassinate another. It's had the most extraordinary intrusion into American official computer networks, and I'm sure in many cases some of ours, an intrusion in the United States, which they are still not sure how deep or how permanent it has actually gone. Are we at peace with Russia, or are we not at peace with Russia? It's extremely complex. And in this grey zone, the media, the battle of competing narratives becomes more and more important. And everybody realizes this. I mean, here you have General Mike Mullen, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the United States, General Stanley McChrystal, former commander of ISAF in Afghanistan, making this point of how important this battle for ideas, the battle for what used to be called, I suppose, hearts and minds is. And it's interesting, it's shared by the other side too. Here you have some of the key Islamic State Al-Qaeda figures saying in their own rather convoluted terms very much the same thing. And this battle for information, this battle for ideas is being waged all the time. This is an online report from Sputnik, the official Russian government-funded news agency and website. It used to be Novosti, but now it's called Sputnik. They are fighting the Russian case in the media all over the world. They had big offices up in Edinburgh in the UK. I think they were thrown out in April of this year because fundamentally, I think the British government had had enough of them, but they're still mounting a very significant challenge. You have this problem of, I've already alluded to, cyber attacks, cyber intrusions, and so on. So much of our defense budget goes to, you know, this testosterone-driven, rather overarmed individual you see before you. Much smaller, tinier amount goes to cybersecurity. So much of cybersecurity rests upon what individuals do, or certainly what companies and corporations do. It's a much more complicated picture. You have a rise in China. Is this a return to a Cold War as we had with the Soviet Union? I would say in some ways it's more serious. I think the Chinese are a much more formidable set of people than the Russians or the Chinese Communist Party is. I think China's, remember the Soviet Union was pretty much separate from the global economy. Its technology transfers to the Soviet Union were strictly controlled. Not the case in China. China is bound in to the American economy and the Western economic model in ways which the Soviet Union was not. So it makes it much more complicated. This is one of the last meetings at the old NATO headquarters before they moved across the road. And I wanted to just use it to talk a little bit about where we get our information from, because that's undergone a dramatic change as well, and particularly at a time when controlling narratives is so important. Interesting sign there, no classified discussion in this area. I've never had a classified discussion with anybody in that area, and I've rarely been told anything by anybody at NATO that isn't the kind of standard boilerplate. And I mean, that's what you get. This is at NATO as well. You know, interviewing a British government minister as he goes in, the famous doorstep, as they call it. That's one of the obvious ways you gather information. And of course, governments are using the new media of information distribution themselves. Currently underway in the Black Sea, exercise Sea Breeze. So the British Embassy is tweeting out about that. You have that on the left. On the right-hand side, you have the Russians tweeting, or the Russian Embassy in this case, tweeting in English their view of the whole thing. Competing narratives, the dash of HMS Defender through Ukrainian territorial waters as exercising the right of international free passage. Well, of course, the Russians played this up as a major drama in so many ways. But then, of course, just by coincidence, there was a BBC correspondent and a male correspondent on the ship. And as we found by the documents that were left at a bus stop somewhere, I think it was, the British government did this quite deliberately. They knew the likely impact. They wanted to be able to manage that narrative. That is why the two correspondents were on board. But there are lots of interesting new sources of information that are not dependent on governments. There's an organization called Bellingcat, which is a kind of network of independent news providers that particularly focus on security and defense issues. This is one of the studies. They're famous for this. They basically, through geolocation of photos, using CCTV material that was sent to them, still material that was sent to them, they were able to track the Buk missile launcher that shot down, you remember the Dutch airliner, wasn't it? No, it was Indonesia. I can't remember whose airliner it was. There were lots of Dutch people on board, but the airliner that was shot down by separatists, or possibly the Russian military, more likely, over Ukraine. They were able to identify the exact vehicle, to follow its passage into Ukraine, and so on. That's a dramatically new kind of source. Similarly, believe it or not, there's a Russian organization which is called, let me just check, the Conflict Intelligence Team, which began in May 2014 in response to the conflict in eastern Ukraine. And quite extraordinarily, they survive in Russia. They put out some remarkable material about Russian casualties in Syria. They follow things like the Facebook postings of Russian soldiers as they go through the Bosphorus on a landing ship en route to Syria and things like that. So here you have two recent pieces from them, one talking about a Russian convoy spotted in the Crimea, another looking at tracking railway trains. I mean, the Russians still use rail transport for their mass troop movements on a very large scale. So that's another interesting source. And then, of course, you had the widespread use of commercial satellite imaging. There was a time when the United States were the only people who had access to satellites. Even if NATO wanted to show you a satellite photo, it would take a week maybe to get clearances from the Americans and so on. Well, now you have academics, you have think tanks, you have all sorts of media as well, who buy satellite photos from commercial firms, which have absolutely sufficient resolution to see all sorts of interesting things. This is a recent piece from the Washington Post, where some academic arms control experts were pointing to a whole sort of farm of, I suppose you could call it that, intercontinental ballistic missile silos being built by the Chinese. You have people who follow very closely North Korea's nuclear program and use similarly satellite photos of, this is the North Korean nuclear facility in Yongbyon. So I've talked about changes in the media and in conflict itself. I think though, and I've alluded to this, and I don't really have any slides, but I think the changes in society are as significant. Think back to the demonstrations against the Iraq War, for example. You can't count on consensus or cohesion anymore. Look at the way the United States has been riven by the so-called culture wars. To some extent, there is a reflection of that here. Defense, the salience of defense issues is much lower, so therefore it has a much lower call perhaps on resources. There's less knowledge, less military experience, which again, as I've noted, is very different from the world most of us grew up in. The media is less interested in defense The BBC, as part of its coming, I retired from the BBC as one of 2 defence correspondents in September of last year. I found the other day that there's even talk now of getting rid of the defence correspondent post completely. Attention spans are lower, competing information sources, people are much more conspiratorial, much more willing to look at conspiracy views of politics and so on. So it makes it all much harder. And that's particularly a problem for a country like Britain with, as I say, very limited resources in many ways, but very significant global ambitions.
And how do these huge and enormously expensive aircraft carriers actually operate?
Well, an aircraft carrier, as its name implies, carries aircraft.
Yes. And what sort of aircraft?
Well, I'm sorry you asked the question, because at the moment we can afford to either have the carriers or the aircraft, but not both.
And never a truer word was said. This is a nice photo. It rather emphasizes the problem. This is, as you know, HMS Queen Elizabeth, which is currently went through the Suez Canal the other day. It's currently on this massive voyage to show the flag and so on. But it has rather more American F-35s, Marine Corps F-35s, I think 8 British ones, 10 American ones. The Americans rather nicely, as you see in this photo, have put on the tail fin, as they do on their own ships, the name of the ship that it's deployed to, which is a nice gesture. Now, is this a very sensible piece of interoperability, which indeed other navies with small carriers in their cases have been doing with the Americans? That's certainly true. Is it, though, as the comedy skit shows, sort of rather embarrassing underpinning of the fact that we can have the carrier, but we can't at this stage afford to build the Britain's own fleet of jets to operate it successfully. So there you are. You know, is this a genuine east of Suez policy? The first time a British carrier has been east of Suez, I think, for about 50 years. Or is it really trying to flesh out the slogan of global Britain? Remember, we got out of the business of east of Suez last time because we simply couldn't afford it anymore. That was back in, I think, in the Harold Wilson days. It's a moot point whether we can really afford it today. So that's pretty much what I want to say. As an unashamed advert, a good while back now, we did a radio history of warfare in 10.5-hour episodes from Hoplite to Harrier, which I did, which is quite fun, I think. And I think it still stands up, although it obviously doesn't include some of the intervening events. And that's still up on the BBC website. And that's the web address if any of you want to listen or dip into any of those programs. So that really, I think, sums up what I want to say. You know, a period of extraordinary change in conflict, in how we go about reporting conflict, and in the audiences that we're reporting that conflict to. And having said that, I'm very happy to discuss, hear your disagreements, answer any questions. You can ask about any of the things I've talked about. You can ask about the BBC. I don't work there anymore. I can quite happily tell you what I think. So James, over to you.
Well, first of all, Jonathan, thank you for an absolutely brilliant presentation. I thought that was absolutely excellent. If people like to unmute themselves, then they can ask the questions. My only question, I suppose I've got 2 questions for you, Jonathan. The first one is, have you been very scared? Has there been a place or a position where you've been actually terrified of a particular instance?
Well, I mean, I would say I was a defence correspondent. I wasn't, as it were, a war correspondent. And I mean, there are colleagues, and Martin Bell is an obvious example, you know, who became very expert. I mean, he did national service, strangely, in the Cheshires, of course, which set him in good stead for the deployment in Bosnia. But, you know, he went to lots and lots of wars, and people like that gain a sort of sixth sense, gain a level of experience. I covered some wars. I went to all of these places, but I wasn't there constantly. And my job was building the big picture. I have been scared. I mean, there have been instances. I mean, I remember being in Bosnia in a town that we went into with the British forces, and you could hear artillery landing, you know, in the distance. And all of the journalists are standing in the doorways going, oh, isn't this terribly interesting? Good Lord, I've never been this close to, you know, artillery before. And if you look around, there are no British soldiers there. They're all downstairs in the basement. And a guy comes out and says, what the hell are you all doing? You know, get down here. So, you know, one has stories. I mean, I remember being, again, with a colleague driver. He was driving in Croatia and in the middle of the war. And we were coming to a culvert and a bridge, and this guy, you know, was the last of the bulldog breed. The foreigner was not going to get past. So we got to the bridge first, and the other guy just stopped before heading over the precipice. And about 4 miles on, we were stopped by a flock of sheep and lorries and everything. And I got out and I was backing him, helping him, guide him backwards because we thought we could get round the lorry. And I turned around and I saw this guy in this yellow car who we'd had the trouble with coming straight at me. And I stepped up onto the rock face and down onto his bonnet. The next minute he got out, took out his pistol, cocked it and pointed at me. And a lorry driver, huge guy, went up and pinned his arms to his side and just said, go. So I dived into the car, off my colleague went. We scraped both sides, one side on the rock and one side on the lorry. We were in kind of hysterics of nervous tension. And we drove to the British base, I think, in Gorny Vakuf or somewhere, a Remy base. And they let us in. And I remember just lying on this oil-puddled floor in hysterics from the tension, giggling away. But I mean, that was quite worrying. You do silly things. I mean, I showed you the thing I pulled out of a tank in the Mutla Gap in Kuwait. That was a silly thing to be doing, rooting around in. Now, there are all sorts
that
of
that was obviously a Russian tank, but
it had been re-equipped with I think British communications equipment inside,
right.
Or else maybe there was a export version of the kit and it was you know, marked in English. But I imagine they probably just bought in new communications gear. So you know, there are things you learn. I mean, I remember being somewhere else in the Balkans and we're driving along. It's a sunny day and there's traffic on the road. All of a sudden, there's no traffic coming the other way. And then we look in the mirror and there's no traffic behind us and we're on our own and there's a hill. So we got out the vehicle sensibly, I think, and sort of walked up to the rise and just had a look. And then some soldier came out of the undergrowth somewhere and kind of explained to our driver, who was a local, that they were expecting a huge Serb attack any moment. And, you know, what the hell were we doing on the road? So we turned around and drove back. Well, if we had been in the military, if we had perhaps been more experienced, maybe we would have had that sixth sense and noticed earlier. So, you know, lots of times when one is kind of afraid, but my job wasn't really to be, you know, I've been at a lot more wars at headquarters and of one level or another, rather than actually with, you know, people at the sharp end. And the Balkans particularly, I suppose, was much more at the sharp end. But, you know, that's the problem. I mean, in wars where there increasingly isn't a clear front line now, you can be in what you think is a relatively safe place, and it's not safe at all, you know. And there's the terrible experience of the 2 ITN correspondents in the Iraq war. I can't remember the poor guy's name now. And they went into Iraq, not embedded, they went in by themselves. And one turned left and one turned right. And the one that turned left was the poor guy that was killed. And the one that turned right, you know, had no apparent problems and was able to attach himself to a US unit. So, you know, it is and I mean, you know, the problem is in these sorts of wars, the Balkans, Ukraine, places like that, the number of journalists that are getting killed is huge. And remember, the definition of journalism has changed. I mean, it can be a young kid out of university with a video camera and a laptop who's decided he's going to be a journalist and sell material to Western news agencies or whatever. And actually the BBC, for I think to its credit, has quite specific and strict rules about who it will take material from, specifically to discourage, you know, people who would take greater risks than the BBC would allow its own staff to take, for example.
Gentlemen, has anybody else got some questions?
Can you hear me okay, James?
Yeah, I can hear you, Adrian.
Hi. Thanks, Jonathan, for the talk. Really quite fascinating on a subject that you don't often spend time thinking about. I'm struck by the line you drew from the length of time it took a message to leave the Battle of Waterloo to what is it now with you sort of talking to a microphone on a train as happening. When you come back in 5 years' time to deliver another speech, what are you going to be talking about, how journalism has changed in the next 5 years?
Well, it's a good question, Adrian. I mean, I think the pace of the technological developments is going to continue to increase. I mean, frankly, we're pretty much there anyway. I mean, you could be with a unit in the field somewhere. I mean, this is one of the problems of these embedded reporters that I mentioned. You're seeing the world through a letterbox. So you could be involved in a ferocious firefight with a platoon of soldiers, and you're able on your mobile phone, if you've got the presence of mind, to, get the sound effects and send something back virtually immediately. How distorting is that? Because it may be a tiny incident in a campaign that by and large is relatively conflict free. I mean, there's too much. I shouldn't say this, but in a sense, there's too much media today. I mean, I don't know if you remember, but during the Kosovo war, NATO pretty well ran out of things to bomb in Serbia, and it wasn't seemingly making much progress. And on one particular day, NATO bombed what they thought was a military truck, and it turned out to be a tractor pulling a farm trailer with civilians in it, and people sadly died. Civilians sadly died. And the media focused on this for about 3 days in the absence of anything else to report on. And the military had to go back and try and find out what specific episode this was. And in this convoy, which had been struck, who had struck this and whose aeroplane. And this all went on, as I say, for about 3 days. Now, I'm not diminishing the seriousness of civilian casualties or the need for care or the need for explanation. But it really does show you that, compare that to the Second World War, where you had area bombing, and even near the battlefront, your own artillery was killing huge numbers of your own people. And today, because of the changes, not just in the broadcasting technology, but the media, but the military technology, you're literally debating in news terms, the success or failure of one precision guided weapon. So that's extraordinary. I think looking at the media more generally, I mean, one of the things that concerns me, and I think we've seen this happening around us, you've already seen it with the decline of the printed press, the amount of foreign coverage that you're getting in the media is less and less. And certainly in newspapers, it's restricted. I mean, foreign coverage is by definition expensive. I think one of the things, the BBC has many problems and it can be criticized for many things, but I think one of the great things about the BBC is the window that it provides on the world. I mean, not least through the network of correspondence on the World Service, by the extraordinary opportunity that the website, the online site, provides for covering things that are not going to be in a short radio or television bulletin. I mean, sadly, I have to say, I think the website at the moment is heading rather more towards the Daily Mail direction, trying to, have more things that people are going to click on and so on. But an important thing about the BBC and its survival is that, amongst other things, it does provide this extraordinary level of overseas coverage. And in a world that is, globalization, and where places like China impinge upon our lives in so many different ways, that sort of foreign coverage is important. So I think a decline in foreign coverage is a dangerous trend, which I fear. I think the media becoming more politicized, and we've seen this in the United States with Fox News and CNN. You've got an element of it here now with some of the new channels that are being set up. That is a problem. And I think perhaps controversially, there is the obverse of the core, and the other side of that problem is that organizations like the BBC need to be a lot braver. I mean, for years, we didn't, as it were, accept that climate change happened or was happening. We always said, well, on the one hand, this, and then we would have somebody who was generally not an expert at all of any real scientific sense saying, oh, it's all a load of nonsense, climate change isn't happening. And then at some point, the crescendo of criticism from eminent scientists and sensible people became such that they said, enough of this, stop trying to balance fact and fiction. Now, I think, you know, some of you will no doubt disagree with me, but I think with issues like the pandemic, with issues like Brexit, we were rather cowardly. We are often balancing fact against fiction, fact against conspiracy, truth against half-truth. And just to be clear, I'm not saying the BBC should campaign in favour of remaining, for example. Some people may think it was, other people think it wasn't. But, you know, my point is more that the BBC should test everybody's arguments to destruction and not take the kind of rather weak way out, which is to say, well, on the one hand, this, and on the other hand, that. You know, there's been a tendency, I think, to say, well, if we're being criticised from both sides, we must be getting it about right. Well, you know, my view very firmly is that the job of public broadcasting is to tell people as close as we can to the truth. And if the truth is uncomfortable, so be it. So if, for example, you might argue that many experts believed that Brexit would harm the economy and produced very convincing arguments to that case, and I think, though, it's hard to, you know, divide up what's happening from COVID and what's happening from Brexit, but the fishing industry certainly isn't happy. And as we were told, part of the whole thing was to save the fishing industry. Quite the opposite has happened. So, you know, I think one's got to be very tough. And, you know, the line to have taken on Brexit was that if you believe in sovereignty or whatever you want to define it as, of course, it's a perfectly reasonable position to say you want to leave Europe, but to examine the arguments to say, if you do vote to leave Europe, these are the consequences. If you vote to stay, these are the consequences. And I mean, there were negative aspects, I suppose, of voting to stay as well. You would still be chained to this extremely bureaucratic organization in the EU and so on. So it is complicated, but those are some of my concerns about the future. And, you know, if people want highly politically motivated journalism, there are so many other places now you can look to get views that confirm your own prejudices, if you like. And I don't think, I think therefore public broadcasting needs to be a little braver. They won't be, I can assure you, but they need to be.
I mean, it was, to my mind, it was disappointing you saying that, you know, defence or, you know, defence is well down. I mean, I see this in, you know, I take the Times. I see, you know, the world affairs section is what you've got news, you've got comments, and then you've got world affairs. So world affairs, which I think is hugely important for our country, is third on the list. Where
well, this is the paradox. I mean, we talk about global Britain, but that is the ranking. And I mean, look, people, it is. I remember going to many years ago, going to a. It's actually when we were gathering the material for that military history series. And I remember going and hearing the great Michael Howard speaking in Stanford, Professor Michael Howard. And he said that, you know, a marvelous phrase, he said that, you know, we have to bring military history back to the grim inner city of combat and away from the lush suburbs of women in the military and gays in the military. And now I'm not knocking any of those things. You know, you can have a debate about how representative the military needs to be of society. I mean, the British military is a tiny fragment of society, and you presumably want the people in it who are willing to go off and kill somebody. And, you know, not many of us necessarily would want to do that. So, you know, it raises interesting questions, but I think it is a problem. It is low down the order of priorities, which is a paradox given the political kind of emphasis on global Britain. There has been a tendency, I think, even, and look, the basis, I mean, I didn't say this, but, you know, when you are a correspondent in the BBC or in any organization, particularly the BBC, because it's got an awful lot of people still working for it, it is a battle to get on air. And if you don't get on air, you get fired ultimately. I mean, not immediately, but after a significant period, you will be gone. And so people put forward things that they think are going to get them on the air.
Yeah.
So, women, the first woman commander of a Royal Engineers battalion might get you on the air. Britain not having any artillery that can outrange Russian weapons isn't going to get you on the air in a month of Sundays. And that is a huge problem. And it means that it actually means that there isn't really any great requirement to be particularly expert anymore, because the sorts of things that would make you expert don't get on air. When I joined the BBC during the Cold War, we'd be writing pieces regularly on, Russian tanks had developed a new form of armor that can't be pierced by Western anti-tank weapons. This was quite free. I mean, there was a big constituency for that kind of material. In those days, obviously working for the World Service, you had all the Eastern European services who lapped up that kind of material. They've all gone. But British society isn't by and large interested in these things.
Right.
Blokes of our age are interested in these things. And it's not that one wants to be a militarist or that these are the most important things in society. I mean, God help us, James, you and I were talking earlier, and the most important thing for the West is the internal strength and cohesion of our own societies. I mean, that's the basis of national power. So, the fact that America doesn't have a proper health service, an extraordinary thing. The fact that our party political message, but they're all terrible, but our government system is so poor, and the caliber of the people engaged in it is so poor. These are all the things which are the building blocks of national strength. I mean, you can go on about the force structure of the British Army, which is frankly appalling, and even with the proposed the whole, I didn't say this in the talk, but the whole period of these counterinsurgency wars has meant not only that there's been an extraordinary drain on resources, trained manpower, people coming to the end of their tours and deciding, I've been in a war, I don't need to be in the military anymore. But it's of course meant that we've been spending vast quantities of money on highly specialized capabilities to fight these kinds of wars. And the ability to fight high intensity warfare has withered on the vine. Our tanks are old, our armored vehicles are old, our artillery is outranged. We don't have anti-air, integral electronic warfare. And in the meantime, as we saw in Ukraine, the Russians, for example, have been plowing on with all this stuff. The Chinese have been plowing on with all this stuff. And it's a huge question now. Where do we put our limited resources? And it's a fascinating question, particularly above all for the Americans. Do you buy the things now that would enable you to, let's say, fight a war with China over Taiwan in 5 years' time? Because that requires buying more of pretty much what you've got now. Or do you skip a generation and buy the things that will ensure your dominance 10, 15, 20 years out? That's a different shopping list. And the problem is you can barely afford one, let alone, to do both. And then you bring in, cyber and all these more conventional threats or unconventional threats, if you like, information warfare. And then you raise the question rightly, I suppose, has the kind of terrorism we've been fighting for the last almost 2 decades really gone away? We just don't know. Are we going to be back doing that again somewhere? I think probably not in the short term. We've learned a lesson, but if the terrorists rear their heads, it's an impossible thing to.
Well, you're painting both scenarios there, because we were talking earlier about Afghanistan and whether the withdrawal from Allied troops from US and UK troops from Afghanistan and other countries, could that be a platform for future terrorist attacks? So you've got the counterinsurgency argument, then you've got the invasion perhaps of China against Taiwan, and then you've got to go to back to basics and have a big army to defeat that.
We certainly are not going to have. And there are all sorts of ways. There's all sorts of ways you can try and square the circle. You can put more elements into the reserves, which certainly in manpower terms are cheaper, but they've still got to have the high grade equipment. It's a huge problem. And
but to cap it all, Jonathan, I think also that the people of the UK and the press of the UK and the media of the UK just don't want it. They're more interested in us getting into the finals of the Euro football or various other things. And I think we're probably in the 30s in the last century, where you got, you know, the rise of China and Russia, and you got the rise of global terrorism coming along, and we're sort of kind of thinking, well, it will never happen again because we got nuclear weapons. But I don't know, maybe I think it...
Of course, nuclear weapons in many ways are irrelevant to all of these things.
Well,
Because
exactly.
the Russians and the Chinese are getting up to their skullduggery apart from nuclear weapons. You know, the nuclear weapon just stops the ultimate interstate conflict from breaking out. But at all sorts of levels below that, conflict is growing. And I think you're absolutely right. And I mean, this is why I had the third leg of that stool, which I didn't have any slides on, but, you know, popular opinion. Popular opinion has changed. Many people feel they have been lied to, rightly or wrongly. As I say, the military experience is seen as something that is totally distant. You know, you have a society, I mean, look, you know, it's fascinating. I mean, I said I worked for this Labour MP when I left my academic studies, and he was a sort of old school Labour MP, guy called Bruce George, ultimately became chairman of the Defence Committee, hugely Atlanticist, hugely patriotic. His constituency, Walsall South. I mean, you know, if you look at opinion polls, many working class people, if you want to call them that in Britain, are still hugely patriotic.
Yeah.
I believe that if somebody does something nasty to Britain, Britain should do something nasty back. And then you have the sort of the chattering classes and the people I worked with, because the BBC is largely made up of these people, and not all of them, but, you know, they've got different agendas. They're interested in, you know, race relations, the treatment of women, transgender things. Now, again, all of these things have their place in a tolerant and fair society, but we've kind of thrown the baby out with the bathwater. The things that are the key to national power, good governance, cohesion, functioning national systems, defense, obviously an important element of that, seem in many ways to have gone by the wayside. And even when they have, you know, massive defense reviews, as they had recently, that last defense review, well, it was a wider, it was a sort of strategic and diplomatic review, really. But, you know, it was very ambivalent on China, which is clearly one of the biggest problems facing the West in the contemporary world. On the one hand, we're wary. We don't want them to sell their telecommunications gear in Britain. We're wary of them running our nuclear power stations. And yet the Chancellor Rishi Sunak the other day was urging people to have much stronger investment with China. We want it both ways. And we're not alone. I mean, you look at most European countries, most EU countries' attitudes to China, to Russia, they're wholly ambivalent. When it's good business, they want to do the business, but they're wary on the security front. You know, but, you know, until the security thing moves up the ladder, and I see no sign of that happening anytime soon, I mean, to hell with it. You can assassinate somebody with radiation on a British street or in a British hotel. Doesn't seem to make a huge degree of difference. You know, oh, they're all as bad as each other. Oh, the Russians have got a point of view too. I was watching RT the other night and they had a completely different report from the way the BBC does it. You know, that's the sort of thing you hear. And, you know, our system is very bad at putting bad people beyond the pale. I mean, look at the recent by-election with George Galloway. And I mean, a man who surely in a civilized society, either there should be some way of stopping him from standing, or in a civilized society, you would hope that he wouldn't get so many votes as he did.
That's about Trump.
Yeah, well, absolutely, but it's a huge, huge problem, and you know, it's not just Trump. I mean, Trump is a figurehead, but you know, the Republican, and we've got the Democrats have got all sorts of problems, but you know, the Republican Party has lost its underpinnings. It has gone completely nuts, and whether it's Trump or somebody else, the likelihood is that whoever is going to carry the standard for the Republican Party at the next election is not going to be somebody, you know, in the George Bush 1 or 2 you know, type. It's going to be somebody much more like Trump, maybe a little more intelligent. But you know, so you know, the world, and I mean this in a sense, I mean, I don't want to be sort of negative, but you know, after all these years of doing this, you know, the world is a much more dangerous and uncertain place today than it has been probably any time in our lives. And I mean, I don't accept, you know, I don't think that the Russian tanks were going to roll into Western Europe. When you really go back and look at it after the Cold War, it wasn't that likely. Yes, there was this nuclear balance. Yes, there were moments when, more likely probably because of mistake rather than design, a nuclear war could have broken out, but that was a function of the lack of discussion, the hair trigger way in which the nuclear deterrent was operated, and so on. I remember there was that famous NATO exercise, Able Archer. When was it? Back in the 70s or something. That Deutschland, no, 89, wasn't it? I think. Anyway, whenever it was. No, it wasn't 89. It was earlier. But there was that Deutschland series, German TV series, which was shown here, three runs. But you know, there was this NATO exercise, and the Russians, the Soviets, for a time, genuinely thought it was the prelude to the war. So there were hairy moments, but you know, fundamentally, I honestly didn't grow up in the 70s and into the 80s and at university thinking that there was about to be a global conflict. I'm much more concerned about things now. It's a much more diffuse threat. You know, it's not, you know, it'd be controversial having a government that responds to an international pandemic efficiently would be a nice thing. You know, if they can't do that, I'm not entirely sure they're likely to be able to respond to the rise of China. Or they're certainly not responding well to the problems posed by Russia. I mean, Russia, in many ways, is a complete straw man. You know, yes, it has nuclear weapons and so on, but it is a hugely weak country. And Russia's power is magnified because the West simply can't get together and say enough is enough. We want decent relations with you, but this is where we're drawing the line, you know? And they're taking advantage of our weakness. China is a different problem. China is a real problem, but thankfully China for us is a very long way away.
Trevor, have you got any thoughts from your from South Africa point of view? You're going to have to demute yourself.
There, we should be okay.
Yes.
And I was just going to say that I probably need to digest things a bit and turn them over in my mind. We have been running through a total mess, a freak out in South Africa, as you probably are aware, with ending finally in the arrest of Jacob Zuma. And we've all been jumping up and down and shouting, hooray. And I think that this could be a turning point for us, that things were going one way, the state capture, as it was often called, everybody enabling everybody else to steal money from the country's fiscus. And you've seen what the result of that can be in a wealthy, reasonably wealthy country in Zimbabwe, where it's gone totally down the tubes. And so the things that have happened in the last few days here are, I think, very significant. I think they're a turning point. I think we may be starting to rebuild the sort of country that we would like to think we've got, which is perhaps the kind of country that looks a little bit towards European countries, where you have a government that is, if it's not responsible of its own accord, which is kept responsible by the people and the voters. And if they don't do right by the people and the voters, they get voted out. One of the great strengths of the United Kingdom. All these changes in government, you probably find it a great nuisance, but it does mean that whoever forms the government knows that they're going to be kicked out, probably at the next election or the one after that. Now, I haven't answered your question, just made an excuse, really, that we have gone through a very anxious period when we've been obsessed by what is going on. I could see some sort of low-level warfare breaking out. It could still happen between the Zuma supporters, who are not unlike the Trump supporters, I think, and he is not unlike a Trump figure. In other words, he and they will talk bullshit, and this is taken up by his supporters and by some of the media, and it's hard to distinguish fact from fiction. And there has been some shooting, but not too much. There's been some blocking of roads and burning of tires and so on, but not too much. I think that may go away. And but there was a worry at one stage that if he held out, that one could see the sort of thing happening that has happened previously in South Africa as a result of apartheid, principally, where you had factions fighting one another. So I haven't answered your question, but just talked about my own obsessions at the moment. And I think we're all immensely relieved that he is now wearing an orange overall and behind bars.
I mean, for how long? Is that going to be only 4 months? I think the other question I wanted to ask you, Trevor, is what is your view of the penetration of China in Africa? Because, I mean, that's quite significant.
It is, and it's interesting to see how they do it. They try to avoid being seen as colonialists, but that is exactly what they're doing.
Yeah.
They'll come in and they'll build you a bridge or a railway line, and those are two examples that have actually happened. And they do it with Chinese labor. They don't use local people. They come in, do it, and get out, and then they take what they want. That could be minerals. Sand, apparently, is one of the big things. China needs huge quantities of sand for all the concrete that they're using. And so they've been ripping it out of Mozambique, destroying the ecology there. They're now ripping it out of Kenya, because they built them a railway line. My feeling is this is far worse than the old British-style colonialism, because at least those people settled in the country. They were derided as settlers, but it did mean that they couldn't let things get too bad. And they had to keep the country operating. And the Chinese don't have to do that. They are interested in resources, not only mineral resources. Rhino horn is a very important export, and lion bones, and for the strange traditional medicines that they have. And they get somebody else to do it, obviously. They pay somebody else to poach the animals, and then they take out what they need. Britain and other European countries had something like the same attitude. Africa is a rich continent. We can go in there and get stuff. And I think that the same feeling is about now. The Chinese, I think, if they want something, Africa's the place to get it. Donkey skins have been a huge, you may have read about this, millions of donkeys being slaughtered for their skins because they boil them down to make some cosmetic. And so China is certainly looming on the horizon, well, perhaps a bit closer than on the horizon, and a little bit too close for comfort, perhaps, because of the modus operandi. And that could be something to worry about as well.
Well, I mean, certainly Britain wasn't any saints in Africa. What's your views on that, Jonathan?
Well, first of all, I'd just say I was struck by Trevor's comparison of Zuma and Trump, because I mean, it is interesting that this kind of populist mode of democracy is happening in Africa, in Eastern Europe, the United States with Trump, Israel maybe with Bibi Netanyahu, and so on. I mean, it does seem to be in many supposedly democratic, India is, I suppose, one of the best examples with Modi. You know, it is a real problem of the moment that this populist style and populist temptation is growing. Now, I think Trevor's points on Chinese influence are very well made. I'd be interested to know whether he thinks attitudes locally have changed towards the Chinese, because I suppose initially there must have been a lot of happiness at the opportunities and the business and the money coming in, but as I think he rightly said, it is a kind of neo-colonialism of a very different kind. It's simply a resource grab in many cases. I mean, do you think, Trevor, there is a noticeable disillusionment with what China can offer?
I don't know. I don't hear about attitudes for or against the Chinese. I think that they do things very cleverly in that they don't annoy the local people. They'll give them something and that's what they want, and they'll get something nice, and then they may find that they are in debt for the rest of the country's lifetime. But it's not something that there is a great obsession about, for or against the Chinese attitude that I can see. They haven't operated that much in South Africa. That's perhaps the thing, except for the wildlife products that I mentioned. But there are some other African countries where they've gone in more strongly. If we need to worry about an Asiatic country, India is a lot worse, and that's because of the Gupta commercial family. And do you know something about that? They were instrumental in this whole state capture business, because they had the power, the economic power to run businesses, take money and distribute it to the people who came sucking up to them. And we're still trying to sort that out. That is making some progress. Some people have been jailed, and some people have been told to give back the money, what there's left of it. And they have moved to Dubai, and a lot of the money went to Dubai or through Dubai. And that seems to be economically the most dangerous country now, where it looks as though there's no really strong legislation against doing that kind of thing. So there are some other countries to be perhaps more nervous about at the present time than China. it's ironic that Chinese are supposedly, they don't like Africans very much, but they are very good at concealing that, and by doing whatever Africans like them to do, which is coming in and investing in things, and but they don't, shall we say, associate in a friendly fashion with African people. Something which is hardly mentioned, but it's a rumor. It may not be as factual as all that, but it's a rumor that this is a Chinese nationalistic feeling, shall we say.
Lovely. Well, it's coming up to 7:30. I think we'll give that a call. Jonathan, is there anything you want to say at all at the end?
No. Just thank you for sticking with it for so long.
No. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I thought that was one of our best talks. I really thoroughly enjoyed that. So
Yes, very interesting.
Well, thank you very much for giving me your time.
I learned a lot that I didn't know.
I hope you don't go away too depressed.
It was always, Trevor, great to see you. Adrian, good to see you as well. Is there anything you want to add, Adrian?
No, just thank you. It's not a topic I spent a lot of time thinking about, but it really I feel a lot more informed now.
Super.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for listening anyway.
Well, thank you, Jonathan, for taking the trouble. Really appreciate that. That was a marvelous talk.
Great pleasure.
And we'll be in touch.
We'll talk soon.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Come over to
Take care now, everybody.
Good night, all.
Good night, all.
Cheers.
Good night. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.